Hello, fictional. Welcome to the What If Issei. Today we are gonna see what if Issei meets with the Kendo girls. Part 5. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. From an outside perspective, things would look as though everything is wonderful. I would mostly agree. Things in our little home have been nearly perfect these last few months. My husband Koji got promoted this year. My son got into a rather exclusive high school. My favorite soap opera got renewed for another few seasons. Those two wonderful girls moved into our home. I've always wanted a daughter. Things right now are nearly perfect. But that doesn't help this crushing guilt I feel. I'm sure some would wonder just what in the world I had to complain or feel guilty about. It's because I almost ruined it all. I had been at the brink of tearing this family apart at the seams and hadn't even realized it. Every time I see my son, Issei, my heart clenches. Whenever Koji smiles at me, I inwardly cringe. How had I been so blind and stupid? When I was a little girl, my mother had frequently warned me about the more lecherous men I'd one day come into contact with. The women of my family had always started to develop rather early. I may not be at the level of the rest of my family had been, but I'm a bit bustier than the average Japanese woman. I took to wearing clothes that hid this fact when I was 14. High school and college had been filled with catcalls and leering men. The occasional grope was met with a knee to the testicles. I knew almost immediately that my husband was a pervert when we started dating. One night he'd gotten drunk enough to tell me that he dreamed of having a harem at one point. He made no attempts to hide the fact that he found me attractive. He also was very transparent that he wanted to know what laid in the mind just as much as what was underneath the clothes. It had taken a rather long time for me to rein him in as much as I have. When we finally had Issei, the world became this scary thing I had to protect him from. I suppose it was a natural thing after 2 miscarriages and years of trying. Koji and I would do anything to make him happy and ensure he was safe. For the first 6 years, everything was perfect. We had this amazingly vibrant little boy looking at the world with shining inquisitive eyes. It still confuses me how he had such a hard time making friends, even the parents of those pint-sized bullies didn't get it. And then came the Shido family and that darling little girl Irina. Those two were attached at the hip for the 2 years they lived next door. Issei was crushed when they left. That was also my spiral into the horrible mother I've been for the last 8 years. My son came home from the park one day, spouting nonsense about floating boobs and the magic they held. The key to happiness, Issei called them. I hoped it would pass. But it didn't. Perhaps it was a combination of my family's early sexual development and Koji's perversion. Maybe it was because Issei had no one to play with that he turned out that way. But we had been so passive in disciplining him up to that point in his life. He hadn't really needed it before. He adored us, listened to whatever we said, and had never really gotten into trouble. By the time he was 9, all he seemed to talk or think about was something sexual. I slipped back into old habits. I berated my son, yelled at him, spanked him a number of times when I caught him looking at porn. The pinnacle of it all came when I found a magazine in his room. I spanked him, barehanded on bare bottom. Later that morning, I found our computer teeming with pictures of naked young women. That was the last straw, and I broke. I saw Ed and took a belt this time. Koji came home early that day and found me beating our son with the buckle of the belt. I had been so angry I hadn't noticed that part. I don't even know how long I'd been swinging, but Issei had stopped crying and just winced at each hit. The argument between Koji and I lasted for hours. He admitted that the porn was from him and not our son. That was a week after Issei's 11th birthday, the last day I hugged him. The last day I told him I loved him. From that point on, I was emotionally distant. Weeks turned into months and I started picking up the occasional part-time job to keep busy. I spoke to my son the same way someone would an estranged second cousin at a family reunion. I treated my husband the same way I did those teachers and classmates who ogled me. Months turned to years and the rift had only deepened between Issei and I. Koji had started working later and later, coming home only after the sun had set. Birthdays and anniversaries were the only time Koji and I would have sex, and it was half-hearted on my part. I believed the Kuo co-ed announcement was both a glimmer of hope and a path to ruin. Even though I hadn't shown it in years, I still loved my son and wanted him to succeed. The school was renowned for its quality education, but I thought the gender ratio would only get Issei into legal trouble. I wanted Issei to go to a good college, but didn't want him to be listed as a sex offender. I hadn't even known that Issei had started working out until he told me about his run to Kuo Academy. I pushed him to go back for the girls' help because I just didn't want to deal with his antics anymore. When he came home with bruises, I thought he'd been lying about trying to correct his behavior and was just getting caught peeking at the girls. Until I had the pleasure to meet Kaori Murayama and Yui Katase, that is. Admittedly, I was rather cold to them the first few times. Girls as pretty and driven as them didn't hang around perverts like my son unless they were after something. Money, favors, a good laugh, I wasn't sure what it was. After a month of those two being around him though, I saw the change. I watched as my son regretfully tossed out his stash of magazines under threat of hardened wood against flesh. That was enough to chip away at the haze I had been in. When he came home a few days later with the worst bruises I'd ever seen on him, I just couldn't hold back from smothering him. My baby boy was hurt and all I wanted to do was hug it away to smother him with the love I'd withheld for too long. My mistakes all came rushing to me as my son stiffened in my grasp. Seeing him nearly in tears from a simple hug, I've been a horrible mother. One day, I'll sit Issei down and apologize for the way I treated him, just as I did with Koji. To know that the late nights Koji spent working had been optional, it hurt. It hurt even more to know that he was wondering how much longer he could take the strain. In other words, how long could he last before filing for divorce? He didn't want to spend time arguing with me or watching me treat our son the cold way I had been, so he spent that time on bettering his career. I watched as those two girls slowly but surely started to fall for the enormous heart that beat in my son's chest. When I tried to warn them that Koji had infected Issei with that harem idea, they simply said they knew about it and would be sure to beat it out of him. After the night that I collapsed, when Issei was assumed to be missing, I started to notice a few things. The first is how attentive Issei is with me. Our relationship is better than I'd hoped and certainly better than I deserve. But it is a cause for concern at the moment. If I hadn't seen some of the games he'd managed to get a hold of, I may not have ever come to this conclusion. When Issei and I are in the same room and no one is speaking directly to him or he's not otherwise preoccupied, his eyes glance over to me every few seconds. Almost as if he has trouble looking anywhere else. When he hugs me now, I can feel him almost melt into my arms, like he wants to be nowhere else. Part of me loves it, the other is worried and a little grossed out. I am not some cheating whore of a stepmother from one of those adult games. I am his biological mother. The affection I show him may be a little more than normal, but I'm just trying to make up for all that I kept locked away. Koji noticed it too and had gotten a bit too aggressive with how he responded. But that seems to have passed thankfully. The second thing I've noticed since Issei started high school is the girls. I understand how Kaori and Yui both came to love my son, even if they deny it. But it's like the sex drives on some of the other girls is on overdrive. From the moment I met them, Momo and Rias seem to already have deep feelings for Issei. I know that their hormones are running rampant at this point of their life, but my god, do they need to get themselves under control. I'm not ready to be a grandmother. 51 is too young. If that redhead starts making a move on Issei, I fear the battle is lost. I'm not sure I like that girl, she's much too charismatic to not be two-faced. But maybe I'm being too harsh and my past experience with girls like that is clouding my judgment. The last thing is directly tied to the second, along with how Issei has been brought up. My son has no idea how to approach, interact, or start a relationship with a girl. All he's ever had are fantasies of well-established and physical relationships. And porn. I can only imagine the pain those girls' parents must feel. I heard the confession Kaori gave a while back as the vents in the laundry room were directly below the room they were in. I felt it was necessary to swiftly intervene and give Issei an out. Poor Yui had clearly been working through her own feelings and coming to grips with them, and her best friend just ups and swoops in first. Before I could knock though, Kaori had said, I know it's unfair of me to do this right now. To you, Yui, Momo and Reya, but I can't help it. I don't want an answer or for anything to change. I just wanted you to know. Honestly, I hadn't known the girl was so mature. The weeks that followed were interesting, to say the least. During the day, and in plain sight, nothing seemed to change between them. They got along as well as they always had, sometimes a small argument over trivial things would come up. They were still teenagers after all. What caught my attention was the way all these girls seemed to know how the others felt and still were marching forward to catching my son's affection for themselves. I even caught Yui sneaking into his room far too late one night. Knowing that she was against anything overly sexual, I wasn't too concerned and decided to get up a little earlier to check on the state of things in the morning. It was adorable, finding Yui snuggled into Issei. She had draped one of his arms over herself and was holding onto it tightly. I was relieved to see they had clothes on and there was no sex stench in the air. I hadn't been as quiet as was necessary, I suppose, because I turned around to find Kaori right behind me, looking directly at the scene as well. The brunette just smiled towards my son and her friend and walked away to get ready for school. That leads to today. That Rias, I think her name was, had stolen Issei for the afternoon. It was obvious by what Issei said to me that it was a date. My oblivious son seemed to have no clue though. Kaori was meeting with her parents to discuss her permanent move to our home, so it was just Yui and I at the moment. I couldn't help but inquire about the strange way these girls were acting. I was worried that someone would get hurt and then Issei would be caught in the middle of it, having no idea what he'd done wrong. Something his father and I were to blame for. I thought about how to word it carefully as the day progressed. Finally, while making lunch, I decided it might be better to be blunt. Yui dear, I understand that this might sound callous, but I need to know something. My pink-haired companion brought her water bottle down from her lips and finally had done as I'd been bugging her to do for months. What is it, mother? When I'd suggested that the two should call me mom, at first it was just a joke. A way to tease how close they were to Issei, but somewhere along the line, that turned into a real desire to have them as my family. She'd only called me that 3 times now and admitted that she couldn't say mom because she'd already had one. Mother was as close as I'd get and that was fine. I know you're in love with Issei and I heard Kaori confess to him. Then there's those 2 student council girls and the date with that Rias girl today. How many girls are pining after my son? And how are any of you okay with this, knowing that there's others? The girl had gone stiff, her hand clenched the water bottle, spilling a good portion of it onto the floor. Well, I did need to wash these hand towels anyway, so they'll do to wipe it up. I had time to place the towel on the floor and let it soak the fluid before Yui came back from outer space. I should have known you'd see through me. Honey, you're as transparent as scotch tape. Kaori said you knew I snuck into his room. She sighed, obviously stalling for time, picking up the towel and placing it in the hamper I had placed around the corner in the living room. I sat down at the table, so she knew that I wasn't going to accept not getting an answer. She was fiddling with her hands when she sat across from me. I don't know exactly how the others feel. But I know Momo and Reya are pretty serious. Before deciding to be a stay-at-home mother, I had wanted to be a child and family counselor. So I knew, based on what I was seeing and hearing, that I would have to be the one to keep her on track. Honey, please answer my question. I need to understand. And for the love of God, don't you dare lie to me. I've already caught Issei 3 times since he started high school. I don't need you girls doing it too. I couldn't very well say that to her though, it'd scare her stiff and she'd clam up. There's 6 of us at the moment. Beep. I don't swear very often. But beeping, damn it. This is all my fault. I didn't stop Issei from diving into the murky depths of being a pervert. Now he was moving to be a womanizing pervert. I'm going to have a grandchild from who knows how many women. Then my son will be some lowlife who can't afford to pay for rent or a mortgage because of all the child support payments. Wait. At the moment. There's going to be more. I think my heart's imploding. Yui couldn't make eye contact with me. At least she was being honest. Yeah, I know how this sounds. Oh no, she's tearing up, I didn't want that. I didn't want to upset her. I just couldn't take being in the dark like this. Yui, I didn't. Those pink eyes, glistening with tears, look right up at me. Issei will not be happy if he finds out I made her cry. It sounds like he's holding something over our heads to get us to go along with it. That, or we're all messing with him to gain something ourselves, like a group of selfish sluts. Not the words I would have used, but yes, basically. As Yui wiped at her eyes, I wanted to tell her that I didn't see her as that kind of a woman. Perhaps I thought she had developed some questionable morals as far as relationships go, but that's it. I'm sorry, I didn't want to start crying. I just feel like I'm getting left behind because I can't suck it up and say that I love him. It feels like my dad leaving all over again. We sat there for almost 20 minutes before Yui calmed down enough to keep talking. Yui, I just don't understand. It felt like I'd been saying that a lot lately. The hopeful daughter-in-law laughed at me. Neither does Ice. I couldn't stop the head tilt or confused sound from coming, which only made her laugh more. He's absolutely clueless. If Kaori hadn't said it right to his face, I don't think he'd ever get it. When Momo or Reya come up and kiss him, Issei thinks they're just testing his self-control. He has no idea how they feel about him. And you're all okay with this? The very definition of a conflicted look came over her face. At that moment I knew that she wasn't entirely accepting of the whole, multiple partner situation she found herself in. I'd like to say no. Or maybe if it were just me and Kaori, I'd be able to swallow it easier. We've been friends forever and always want to live with each other. We've done everything together since we were 4. Koji can never know about this. He'd scream about his son completing his harem dream from a skyscraper with a megaphone. Then he'd probably try to persuade me to get in on the idea. And then I would have to finally tell him about his shortcomings. That is not a conversation I want to have, ever. Faking the second orgasm is a hell of a lot easier. You'd like to say no, but come on girl, if my mind can wander through several different thoughts and still keep up, you gotta speed it up. Yui shook her head, she mumbled something she obviously didn't mean for me to hear, but I'm used to listening for a boy who liked to hide his porn habits from me. Why are you pressing so hard? She looked to me with a bright blush. Here we go, now I get to hear how my son is building a harem and not even knowing about it. One of the times I snuck into his room, I didn't intend on laying there all night. One of the times, eh? So it happened before I caught you. It was when he was sick, I went in to check on him. He was mumbling, so I leaned in to hear what he was saying. This is starting to feel too much like a cheesy romance movie. Keep going. It was too incoherent, so I was just gonna head back to bed. When I went to stand and leave, he turned and his arm brought me down to the bed. Yui wasn't even seeing me anymore, now she was reliving the memory. I don't think I've ever seen that loving smile on her face when she was with my son. She'd done a commendable job of hiding it from him. Issei is a lot stronger than he looks, and I couldn't move. When his arm pulled me in closer, it was like. Come on. Don't stop now, it's just getting good. I mean, I get that we're talking about my son here, but this sounds so sweet. Like he would do anything to just keep me there in his arms. It was so warm. Ooh, oh, your blush is so cute, I just wanna pinch your cheeks and hug you. Somehow, he knew it was me he was holding on to. I know the smile that's on her face right now. I've seen it, I've felt it. I snuck in 3 more times before the one you saw. Every time, it's the same. He holds me like I'm all that matters, even after Kaori confessed. I'm sure the whole handful of girls chasing him thing will bug me. But if the way he holds me never changes, I'll never leave. I should still be upset that my son seems to be leading these girls on, even if it's unknowingly. I should feel responsible for the morally wrong choices that I have led him towards in my negligence. But looking at Yui at this moment, I can't help but feel proud of what is happening before my eyes. My son is finally getting the love he deserves. It's an incredibly abnormal situation, but when has Issei ever been normal? As long as everyone is at the same understanding that Yui is, I guess it's just not my place to intervene. There is still something I want to know though. You said that Momo and Reya were serious, what about that Rias girl? The speed at which Yui narrowed her eyes was astonishing. Between that and her clenched jaw, it was obvious how she felt about the busty redeed. Kaori and I are doing anything we can to keep her away from him. That was apparently the end of our discussion because Yui had gotten up and left. I guess my intuition about her was right. So why is Issei on a date with her right now? Hold on a moment, I never found out who the 6th girl was. Walking through the crowded streets, one arm being held onto rather securely and the other in his pocket, Issei was confused. Yesterday, his king had asked if he'd assist Rias. Having no plans for the day, he'd agreed, thinking it was something devil-related in some way. As far as he could tell, nothing about where they'd gone or anything they'd done was related to the supernatural. Other than the amount of money that had been thrown around. That certainly wasn't normal. Taking the train into the same general area that Issei had met up with his old friends, he discovered that there was a similar setup only a few blocks away. Most were stores that catered to media and pop culture, with stands selling merchandise for musicians, movies and other groups just outside. Seeing the price tags made him realize the reason why this area seemed so different from the one he usually visited. Exclusive t-shirts and other clothing from the tour, figurines with certificates of authenticity, meet and greet tickets for artists that usually never did them. All of it was at least 3 times what he'd usually see. This set of shops and stands were for the upper class, a way to separate themselves from the common rabble of otakus and fanatics. Issei found it rather insulting. Part of what was so amazing about these fanbases was how they could all come together over a single topic. It didn't matter whether you were rich or poor or what you did for work. Conventions were much the same to him, underneath whatever costume you chose was a person with a passion. That was what mattered. Not the clothes or the status you held. He was starting to regret his choice of apparel as the heat of the day kicked in. Low-top black and white Chuck Taylor shoes, khaki pants, plain red t-shirt with a black buttoned cardigan that was left open. The only accessory he had on at the moment was the bracelet of the Gold Dragon King on his right wrist. The pants were fine, but he probably should have checked how hot it would be today when he decided to wear the cardigan. How about we stop for lunch? Reya said from directly to his left, still attached to his arm. Having only seen her a few times and talked to her once, Issei was surprised by how close she was to him today. Although if he were being honest, the wide-eyed stares they got when walking past the shop owners that he knew was pretty damn satisfying. Sounds good to me. Did you have anything in mind? He asked, his eyes not able to keep from wandering up and down her frame. Unlike Issei, Rias had chosen something to wear that let her stay nice and comfortable. A white sundress that reached a little more than halfway to her knees. The strap looped around her neck instead of the usual shoulder straps. Her crimson hair, normally flowing freely, was tied into a ponytail. It was as if everything had been meticulously chosen to show off just the right amount of skin or cleavage. Women were truly devious and calculating creatures. She wore no makeup, not that she needed any, aside from some lip gloss. Her skin was perfect, light complexion with no blemish, scars or other marks to be seen. She had no reason to resort to the sorcery known worldwide as cosmetics. Rias had her own peerage to assist her in anything she wanted. So what was this prime example of young feminine beauty doing asking for his company on what was little more than a shopping spree? If she were human, her figure alone would have made picking any guy to escort her a breeze. Those blue-green eyes glimmered with a clarity and shine that would captivate those who didn't care to look. And her silky voice would have turned the heads of those trying to ignore anyone around them. Her smile and personality only further added to her already staggeringly perfect image. They had met up at his house, for reasons she hadn't explained. His father had been about to set off to work on some project that was taking up a lot of his time and had nearly become a drooling mess on the floor when he answered the door. Rias had been polite to everyone home, but for some reason, Yui and his mother weren't as receptive to her as the males in the household. The heiress tapped her chin, scanning the street for somewhere to grab a bite to eat. She must have seen somewhere that caught her attention because she immediately set her course. Let's try this place up ahead. She had smoothly brought her arm from its place wrapped around his and down to lace their fingers together as she guided them forward. Issei quickly adjusted to the change of pace, only being dragged for half a second. He did slightly raise an eyebrow at the change to her holding of his hand. He didn't mind, in fact he quite enjoyed the soft touch of her hand, but it did paint an impossible picture from an outside perspective. A young man and woman spending time together in the city. The woman holding herself close to the young man beside her, smiling as they talked about various things. Taking in the surroundings and the appearance of the duo, it would look like a date. One in which an average-looking guy who probably had too much money on his hands had bribed his way into getting the girl's attention. In this part of the city, it had been seen too many times to count. I sees a beautiful girl that is so far out of his league, they might as well reside in different galaxies. Guy whispers sweet words of never-ending gifts and extravagant vacations. I puts on a front of the caring and loving boyfriend until the girl inevitably lowers her guard enough to lay on the bed of lies and deceit, being stripped of the innocence that had endeared her to him. Getting what he wants, the guy moves on to the next unsuspecting gem that catches his eye. Rinse and repeat. The bystanders and shop owners would never know just how wrong that assumption is. It was more likely to be the other way around. Classes, paperwork, clients, peerage duties. It seemed as though it was a never-ending cycle. Throw in the occasional meeting with her family, and Sona was ready for a break. Before this school year, it was relatively easy, given her talents. She was a natural at running the school from the shadows and had been doing so since the beginning of her first year. Her time management was impeccable, her attention to detail, precise. She shuddered at what would happen when the figurehead that was the current student council president returned from her time away. That girl had no respect for the job, all it was to her is a popularity contest. She made a note to tell Issei that he had to start wearing the bracelet at school soon. But Sona wasn't certain that would be enough. Issei wouldn't know what hit him and the girls would be upset if Ayla got to him first. Damn succubus, she's lucky to have descended from one of the queens. Sona would have booted her out of the territory otherwise. It felt nice to know that she could handle the workload that would be expected of her once she opened her own school. But there was still so much to do. Property to obtain, a building to construct, teachers to interview and hire, students to enroll. Tuition to calculate and salaries to negotiate. Taking her glasses off, Sona rubbed the bridge of her nose. She'd been staring at this particular form for a while now. There were several pages documenting a timeline of events to come and the last few pages detailing a contract. The papers were only part of what was causing her head to throb. It was surprising to see that it was her far too affectionate sister that gave the least resistance to her plan. It just went to show that Serafal truly only wanted what made Sona happy. Not that Serafal had any say in family matters anymore. Her parents only even listened because she emphasized how her plans would further the reputation of the Citri name and the influence they'd gain. The fact that she was looking to marry a mere servant still grated on their pride and nerves. Sona, take a break and have something to eat. Please. Her queen said as she walked into the office, a tray with a variety of sandwiches spread about. Setting the tray on the desk, covering the papers, it was clear to Sona that Tsubaki wouldn't take no for an answer. You win. Just a small break. She said with a sigh. Tsubaki sat across from her, both picking up a sandwich. As the queen finished her first and prepared to eat one more before getting back to work, Tsubaki broke the silence. How is the planning coming along? Their reactions were less than pleasant. Sona placed her cup down back onto its saucer, giving her friend an exasperated look. My parents refused to help with something they see as a pipe dream. They made it abundantly clear how they view my plans for the future. Somehow, Lord and Lady Citri had gotten wind that Sona was looking at property near the edge of their controlled lands. The meeting that resulted from that was less than cordial. It was heated, filled with curse words and rather negative depictions of her character. In an uncharacteristically emotional display, Tsubaki placed a hand over her own, a sad smile on her lips. They're wrong. They're wrong about you, and they're wrong about him. It was something that only Sona had seen before. Tsubaki never liked showing how she felt about anything to anyone else. The rest of her peerage was fairly new, and there hadn't been anything to bring out the real Tsubaki since any of them had joined. Hopefully that would change sometime this school year because they were all tiptoeing around her still. Especially her pawn. Sona couldn't blame him either. Sona kept her mask up just about all the time and hadn't really had a chance to connect with him yet. It was just that there was so much to do, so much to prepare him for. To be what she needed, Issei had to have power, enough power to overwhelm someone touted as a prodigy amongst his already powerful family. He would need to develop a mind capable of strategy cunning enough to outplay the nobles that would seek to see him drown in the depths of inferiority. He needed to be at the level of a pure-blooded devil that had trained most of their life. And he only had a year to do it. Those circumstances didn't leave a lot of time for niceties, pleasant conversations, flirting and dates. Things that she could feel he wanted through her ever-growing connection to him. Sona had never lied to Issei. But she had certainly left a large portion of the details out. She felt that was for the best, at least for now. She had told him that people would be watching him once he became known to the masses. Those of lower standings would be watching to see what another low-class devil could accomplish when given the opportunity. Those of the upper class would watch to see what a Longinus user would bring to their race. Would the fact that he held one of the 13 treasured tools of God bring chaos? Or would it be the thing they needed to make the other factions be more wary of taking them lightly? Lucifer and Beelzebub were decent enough at that, being stronger than almost every other being alive. But having another certainly wouldn't hurt. Thank you, Tsubaki. Words alone won't be enough to show my parents how wrong they are. He may have won over my sister already, which is surprising enough as it is, but he's not ready to face the challenges ahead of us yet. Tsubaki nodded to her king, bringing her hand back to resume her lunch. As Sona made to do the same, she wondered if a year was enough time to get it done. Even if I can persuade Tiamat to train him, I'm not sure that'll be enough. His strength is coming along nicely, but that means nothing against an opponent that can regenerate almost endlessly. There was still much to do to prove her parents and the devils as a whole that heritage isn't everything. But the thing she wanted to prove the most was that her mother was wrong. The serious Citri would regret calling her daughter a low-bowling whore, relegating herself to a $5 prostitute whose only goal was to find a man with a hint of ambition so she could spread her legs and beep said man into keeping her around because she amounted to nothing herself. Needless to say, the mother of Sona Citri had a rather colorful vocabulary when she was angered or caught off guard. If Sona were the type to retort to her elders, she would have asked her mother, "Isn't that exactly what you did?" That statement wasn't worth the repercussions, for obvious reasons. She wanted their support, not to be disowned. It wouldn't have mattered how good saying that would have felt. The waitress had come and taken their orders, gave them some water until the drinks were prepared, and made herself scarce. The place Rias chose was nice. An open-air cafe, the windows and doors removed to let the warm breeze and fans keep the customers cool and comfortable. It felt like a place you'd expect to see in an area that never dropped below early summer temperatures. This area of Japan didn't get nearly as cold as others up north, but it still did get to freezing for a small portion of winter. The feel of the place was relaxed, but had a distinct upper-class look, just as the shops they'd gone in. The servers were in well-maintained uniforms, the floor was freshly waxed. The decorations were light in number, but well-placed and helped to only boost the atmosphere. Noticing that there were no prices on the menu, Issei decided to just go with something simple and cheap, so he didn't drain too much of the cash in his wallet. They can be a little heavy-handed sometimes, but they mean well. The worst time was when we were looking for the tailor that did our uniforms. Issei admitted as he rubbed the back of his head. Rias had brought up the topic of his two kendo friends after she confirmed that the two were currently living with him. She'd inquired about how they met and the progression of their friendship. To her, it was both a way to make conversation during the time their food was being prepared and a way to learn more about him. Gathering information on the romantic situation was merely a bonus. He'd pretty much been an open book, not shying away from anything she asked. It was refreshing to meet someone like that. The more she heard, the more interested she became in the small details, either about him or the situation he described. "I take it, you got into a little girl trouble," she said, humor clear in her voice. Her teasing smile made that even more apparent. You can say that. The training afterwards was pretty brutal." Issei winced a bit, remembering the vicious beatdown he got after hitting on what had to be the hottest older women he'd ever seen. I can't believe they dragged me away like that. She was actually flirting back. Gah. So not fair. He thought bitterly. Issei would forever remember that face and body. Long legs, wide hips, possibly after effects of being a mother, small waist with huge tits that bounced like none he'd ever seen. And that face, it was enchanting. Sharp features, soft skin, with those piercing violet eyes. Her brown, medium-length layered hair just made her eyes pop more. Chances are that he'll never see her again. Which was a shame, because he would never know just where that talk could have led them. But enough about me, what about you, Ms. Japanophile? If you had to pick one thing you like the best about Japan, what would it be? Issei asked that just to draw attention away from himself. He wanted to know more about the girl he'd agreed to try and save, but mainly he just didn't want to embarrass himself today. If he did, Sona would hear about it in no time. Issei was looking for ways to get into his own king's good graces. They got along well enough, and their connection through his 8 pieces certainly helped. But aside from being able to get a vague idea of what she was feeling, he really knew next to nothing about Sona Citri. He knew that she loved her peerage, but it was always work with her. Issei wanted to know how to get her to loosen up for an afternoon and have some fun. Ria's eyes lit up and her fanaticism came out in full force as she animatedly talked about anything she found interesting about the country. Riya stared, wide-eyed, at her date. Every part of her body tingled in joyous rapture at what had just happened. Her breathing came in haggard rasps, uneven and difficult. Her cheeks felt like they were burning with that same deep red fire Issei had displayed in the few training sessions she had been witness to. She would deny to the end of time that her paternal trait was flaring up in full force, causing her beats to be harder than diamonds and as sensitive as a shame plant, and her rose, sopping and ready to be plucked until she couldn't sit, stand or lay comfortably. Preferably for the next week, if she had any say in it. The bracelet that Issei was wearing had been an increasing curiosity for her throughout their day together. Black and gold links with obvious supernatural runes expertly carved into them. Other than the markings and craftsmanship, it didn't appear all that special to her. But by the Satans was she wrong. After their meal, a rather mediocre one for the price in her opinion, she had decided to walk while holding onto his right arm. She had been thoroughly enjoying his company today. Rias knew that Issei was hiding all sorts of dirty, perverted, and possibly kinky thoughts about her and a number of the girls they'd seen. But even so, they had found similar interests that made being with each other casual and effortless. Being that they were in the heart of Otaku country, anime was a common topic. Rias had been pleasantly surprised to hear about the depth in which Issei Haidu loved his family, a facet of him that was mirrored by her own ideals. Finding out that protecting the ones he cared for was a main reason in his joining of the Citri peerage warmed her heart. She would just have to earn the acceptance and approval of the women living at his house. Something that she was already starting to make plans for. Mr. Haidu was not an obstacle in this regard, that was apparent when they met this morning. The light glinting off the bracelet brought her attention to it, making her take a closer look as they walked off to the next shop she had wanted to visit. Her curiosity had reached its peak when she caught sight of the dragon carved into the gold links, and she couldn't help herself. Ever since learning that he was the Red Dragon Emperor and hearing the voice of El-Shalivatain, she had been infinitely more curious about both Ice himself and dragons as a whole. Unfortunately, she and her peerage had been kept busy by clients and the annual increase in strays. Summer had always brought about more servants rebelling against their masters, as the longer days decreased the weaker masters living in the human world. Aside from catching a glance of him during school, they'd only spoken the day she bumped into him at the beginning of the term. Rias had been looking forward to getting to know him better and learn more about him herself. Hearing about him from Sona and Tsubaki was nice and all, but they always gave a somewhat lackluster review. They never mentioned anything about interests, only about his training and how he handled his own temptations with women. As long as things stayed the course they were going today, Rias could honestly see her and Issei coming to love each other over time, if they didn't already by the wedding day. Walking into a shop that sold somewhat obscure manga, Rias wanted to find a gift to bring her adorable nephew Milikas for when she went home during the break. Sure, his mother would be unhappy about the gift not having anything of value to add to his education, but it would make him happy. And that was what Rias wanted the most. His parents and grandparents could handle the rest. She wanted to be the fun aunt. "Your nephew likes manga?" Issei asked her, scanning over the long aisle of books that had been collecting dust for a while. Picking one up about a team of militarized squirrels, Rias nodded. "I think I might have influenced him a bit too much to his parents' liking." She chuckled, remembering the looks that Grafia had given her. The boy needed to have more fun, he wasn't being prepared to be the next head of the family, so he deserved it. "You're only a kid once." Issei smiled as he agreed with her. He wasn't the suave pretty boy type that you'd see charming girls by the dozen. Issei had his own charm. It was much slower to catch you in its grasp, but so much more effective. His desire to make the women in his life happy added to the dragon's aura that slowly leaked from him. It was like a black hole slowly dragging you into its center. Once you were there, you'd never escape. Part of her wondered if she'd ever want to. Rias had disregarded something she heard in passing from Momo and Reya when she'd conversed with Sona. Something about a tidal wave of that dragon energy. She thought they must just be inexperienced with more powerful beings. What she had felt all day was nowhere near as powerful as they described. Now that she had something for her nephew, Rias set her sights on teasing her date. To see just how he'd react to all of the pictures while being with her. The shop she had lured him into was known for its obscure collection. But also for its large section of sexually explicit material. Issei hadn't given any indication that he'd seen the curtain off to their left, marking the adult-only section. Sliding her fingers down his arm to once again lace their fingers together, Rias tugged him towards it. Let's head over here, there's something my queen wanted me to find. The kendo had said that she wouldn't mind a few materials to refine her tendencies, but she'd never said that Rias should go looking for them, or ask her to for that matter. For oblivious Issei just nodded and walked along with her, towards the curtain. Just before Rias had walked through it, she could feel Issei stiffen behind her, having realized where they were going. A small hiccup passed, and he reluctantly walked along into the area. Humming through the curtain, the light was rather dim. The covers of each book placed as though they were enshrined here were unreadable in the current light. That was most definitely on purpose. What shop owner would want people masturbating in their back room? Rias watched as Issei passed underneath and joined her, looking straight at her and nowhere else. She hid her smile and pretended to look through the various fetish sections, while keeping an eye on him discreetly. Rias noticed a group of covers with rather large busted women and saw Issei had trouble not looking at them. That was good to know, there would be no problem in his desire for her body, even though she hadn't really been worried about that from the start. Try as he might, Issei had been occasionally checking her out throughout the day. Mostly her chest, put on display as it was with her low-cut sunbursts. She had gotten used to being stared at a long time ago, so it didn't bother her, as long as that was where it ended. Touching required permission, which she had never given to any man. Lady Gremory, would you mind if I waited outside? She stopped immediately. The usage of her title and last name was slightly alarming. He'd taken her advice and just called her Rias almost all day. Right now, it felt like they were back to square one. Am I making him uncomfortable? She hadn't thought, with the history he had in middle school, that he'd be at all put out by this scenario. Rias figured that being in a porn section with a beautiful girl would be a huge turn on for him, possibly a bit distracting, but that's it. His eyes were closed tightly now, as if he didn't trust himself to be in here with her. Not wanting to sound worried that she had gone too far with her prank, Rias tilted her head and asked him as innocently as she could. Do you not like being in here with me? Without opening his eyes, Issei shook his head. I'm a guy, a pretty perverted one at that, being in here with a girl as drop-dead gorgeous as you is like accomplishing a weird dream I didn't even know I had. He slowly opened one eye to look only at her. But that part of me has only ever caused trouble. I've worked really hard to control myself, and ever since joining Kaichu, it's only gotten harder. Thinking over the group of girls that he had to spend extended amounts of time with, specifically the bishops and the kendo girls, she could see his dilemma. The Citri bishops were encouraging him to make a move on them, while the two human girls were adamant that he hold himself back. Stepping closer, Ria's hand stopped on his right wrist where the bracelet was. No longer wanting to play with him, she was starting to feel a little bad about it, putting all the work he'd put into himself in jeopardy. Okay, I'm sorry for doing this to you, I just wanted to mess with you a little. Sliding her fingers over the cool metal, Rias saw Issei open his eyes directly towards her, still not wanting to chance looking around. But while we're alone, could I ask you one question? He nodded, her index finger and thumb coming to latch onto the bracelet, wanting to drag it into view as she asked her question. But it was never able to be brought forth. The spot her fingers had grabbed was right on the clasp, pressing the sides in and releasing it from his wrist. Her hand lifted just enough to remove the jewelry completely from him, leaving it dangling in between her fingers. There was no wind, no physical force that acted upon her. But Rias would testify on her entire family's life and fortune that something had encompassed her entire being. At that moment, the room turned black except for one thing, one person. Issei Haidu. When she had removed the bracelet, he became everything, the only thing that she could see, hear, touch or taste. Between the absolute black and the man before her was a deep red aura. It was deeper than the color of her hair. Darker than the power her mother gave her, that IsseixSona's wielded with masterful precision. It swirled around him like a fire that had no flame, no target. But the hunger was there. It wanted everything. It wanted her, this shop, this city, this country. It wanted the world to bow to it and wouldn't stop until it had achieved that very goal. To ravage the world in its fiery dominance. All that Ria's gremmery was and ever would be was insignificant compared to that, to him. A part of her realized that she should be afraid, terrified even, of who stood in front of her. Tales of the Red Dragon emperors of old often depicted dozens of enemies being frozen in fright and awe as they realized the folly of standing against that single being. Against the one encased in the red armor of the dragon of domination, they were nothing but ants. Even as that fiery aura shifted, swirling around the two of them, Rias felt nothing but desire. As her pupils dilated and her body felt like it was burning from the inside out unless it was ravaged by Issei, she stepped towards him. Ria's mind was nearly empty, except for the desire to strip down and present herself to him, hoping that he'd enjoy the show she would put on, just for him. For weeks after the events that occurred in that curtained-off area, Rias couldn't even stand to be in the same hallway as Issei, too embarrassed by what she'd done. Ria's face had been as red as her hair when Sona forced her to reveal the details. She truly should have known better when she told Sona that her pawn's evil pieces were acting up. Sitting up in her bed, Momo looked to her phone, which was lighting up her ceiling at the moment as it rang. She moved a blanket, revealing how sheer the ice blue nightgown she had donned was. If she were wearing a bra at all, you'd be able to see it, clear as day. She hated wearing underwear to bed, it got uncomfortable with her being a hot sleeper. The thin garment was as far as she could go, so she didn't wake up covered in sweat. Picking the device up off her nightstand, she blinked to get used to the change in light. Her curiosity was piqued as she saw the name of the caller. Kaori Murayama. She had only called her once since they'd started to become friends. It was definitely strange for her to be calling after midnight though. Something must have happened with Ice that she wanted to talk about. Pressing the green button, Momo brought it up to her ear, trying to sound more awake than she truly was at the moment. "Hello Kaori, what's up?" Momo adjusted the strap that was threatening to leave her shoulder. "No sex." The wide eyebrow quirked upwards. "Have I missed something?" The girl's voice sounded strained. Kaori had told her and Reya that she'd be meeting with her parents today and would probably have a parental meeting with the Haidu family soon. "I think we all have." Kaori must be fairly agitated to be so short with her right now. Momo had been thankful that the two human girls had warmed up to at least her and Reya as quickly as they had. They talked without Issei around with some frequency, so she had been able to pick up on a few habits and tics the brunette had. "Kaori, I can tell that you are upset about something. Take a breath and tell me what it is, I know you called me for a reason." Her enhanced hearing caught the signs of Reya moving about, probably from the ringing of the cell phone waking her up. Her roommate probably thought they were being summoned for an emergency stray hunt. Momo heard Kaori take her advice, taking a deep and slow breath, letting it out the same way. Issei had his date with Rias today. The door to her bedroom opened, revealing Reya in just her bra and panties. It was quite something to see how long her friend's hair was when out of the braids. It reached down to her knees when unrestrained. It was wavy thanks to her preferred hairstyle. Reya leaned against the doorframe to wait and hear what their orders might be, if there were any. "Yes, he did. What happened that has you so upset?" Momo smiled towards Reya, watching as the brunette devil wiped at her eyes. She flashed her phone towards her briefly, so Reya could see the name on the screen. Reya nodded, letting her posture relax a bit before walking over. "He wouldn't say. He was all smiles when I got home though, so obviously something happened." Reya sat beside Momo, leaning her head on Momo's shoulder. Momo draped her arm around her friend, rubbing her shoulder as she talked on the phone. "You didn't press for him to tell you?" She was honestly surprised. Those two girls were very protective and nosy when it came to Issei and each other. "I wouldn't want someone getting all the details if I were in that position. He's also been very affectionate tonight." Momo pouted as she heard that. "How affectionate?" Kaori paused, seemingly unsure if she wanted to share what had happened earlier. A resigned sigh came over the line. "Pinned me to the wall and kissed me until we were both almost blue in the face. That affectionate." Now that was certainly out of character for Issei. She wished she had been there to get in on the action. For some reason, he still didn't see her and Reya's actions as true romantic affection. "I hope Yui wasn't in eyesight," Momo said cautiously. Reya had caught the last full sentence from Kaori and was now paying very close attention. The two of them had a conversation pertaining to upping their game just the other day. The only thing holding them back had been the agreement between them and the kendo duo. "She was," Kaori admitted. "When he was done with me, he gave her a hug that was so close that I was almost jealous he didn't do that instead, then kissed her on the cheek before bouncing up to his room." Momo thought for a moment, moving her hand from Reya's shoulder to stroke her long silky hair. The other bishop gave a content sigh, melding back into her friend's side. "Then something must have happened between the two. But your first words make it seem like your certain things didn't go too far. Otherwise I think you'd be with him, a few pieces of clothing removed, rather than talking to me." Momo smirked at the embarrassed groan that came to her ear as Reya giggled in amusement. The devils have no shame. Seriously, it makes me think you're all just ready to get naked at a moment's notice. Momo stopped stroking Reya and sat up towards the edge of the bed. I don't hear you denying it. We're more susceptible to our urges, but we are able to control ourselves. Reya sat up, snatching the phone from Momo's hand and placing it to her own ear. She gave Momo a wink before speaking. Hello Kaori. So tell me, how long will it be before I can blasphemously scream his name to the heavens? I'm counting the days until I can have him thrusting into me so hard that I can't see straight. Hearing the human choke on air on the other end of the line was music to her ears. Momo covered her mouth so she wouldn't burst out laughing, making the situation worse. Why are we friends again? Kara's voice lacked any emotion. Reya gave the girl credit for how fast she recovered. She hoped that it was a sign that all limitations to the truce would be called off soon. Whatever, no sex, and anything else is fair play. Reya smirked and decided to play with the girl just a bit more. Oh? So if I wanted and he was willing, I could take that throbbing hard. Momo quickly snatched the phone back from her friend and gave her a tap on the head for antagonizing the human girl. Add Reya, down girl. Reya stuck her tongue out towards Momo, wholly unrepentant for her actions. Sorry about that Kaori, she's getting antsy. Momo laid herself down, legs hanging off the side of the bed, her free hand resting on her stomach. I know. How are you holding up? There were a few ways she could answer that question. Momo could go into the nitty-gritty of how she was keeping herself compassed when around a certain pawn, but she knew the Kaori would just pull back. It was best to let her infer the details rather than lay it all out. Reya had obtained a certain battery-operated device that she used to ease the tension. Momo had decided against doing the same, preferring to take a more personal approach. Warm fingers were much better than room-temp silicone in her opinion. Kaori did not want to hear about that. Momo and Reya didn't disagree on much, sex was one of only 3 topics. Reya tried to persuade Momo to use her new toy, saying that it would make her real first time more enjoyable, not having to go through the pain of her hymen tearing. Momo, however, believed that it was a part of the experience and connection between lovers. She wanted that experience in its entirety. I want more. How much more, I don't know. I get it. It's the same for me. There was silence over the phone as the two girls thought about their perceived boundaries. How's Yui coming along? Reya asked from the side, back to her compass self. Momo brought the phone away from her ear and put it on speaker so they could all converse easier. The question was repeated, just in case Kaori had missed it. That's actually a part of the reason I called. The two devils gave each other a confused look briefly. Yui is close, I think. She had a talk with his mom today that seemed to help give her a little more courage. She snuck into his room again tonight. Reya smiled along with Momo. That was mostly good to hear. But now his mom wants to talk to the 4 of us. She knows that we're all looking to be in a relationship with him together. The smile dropped off their faces. They hadn't really considered how to explain things to his parents. The shared thought had been to just hide it from them. Look, this whole thing is still confusing to me. I don't know even how a monogamous relationship truly works, let alone whatever this is. But I know Issei, and honesty is something he values very highly. I think we should be as honest with her as possible without going into the whole devil part. Issei watched from his state of astral projection as Yui once again snuck into his bed. The first time he saw her do it, he felt both nervous and embarrassed. It was something that seemed so intimate. But his pink-haired friend was always the quicker one to lash out. So he was sure that Yui would let him know if she didn't like anything that transpired that she didn't like. The third time he was aware of it happening, he noticed the way she relaxed after she settled in. That was how he got over the negative thoughts and just enjoyed the moment. Issei greatly enjoyed the thought of him being the thing she sought for comfort. Seeing her come into his room tonight was a little different. She didn't look like she came in for whatever comfort he afforded her. This time, she looked like she was trying to work herself up for something. What it was, he didn't know. You and I both know that's not true, Ice. Alsha thought to him. They had been practicing his projection yet again to see how long he could hold himself and the Norse fire dragon at a distance. Tonight they had floating 500 feet in the air for about 40 minutes. What if I'm wrong though? It could ruin our friendship if I just assume that she's interested in me that way. That was why he hadn't really done anything after Kaori confessed to him, not even give her a reply. Kaori said that she didn't want things to change. Issei took it to mean that, even though she said she was in love with him, she didn't want a relationship. Honestly, it was all very confusing. Why bother telling him then? Being able to kiss her without fear was pretty awesome though. Trust me when I say, you're not wrong. She just needs some time to get it out. Since the events at the end of his day with Rias, Issei had been in a mindset close to his old middle school days. The two of them had silently agreed not to talk about what transpired in that dimly lit room. As such, he made no attempts to stop himself from taking in the image of Elsa, who decided that she would only appear in clothes inside the boosted gear or when he finally manifested her for others to see. So far, this trick had been his little secret. His selfish desire to keep her to himself. Back to the topic at hand, if Yui noticed his rerouted blood flow, it wasn't apparent. I should talk to her. He thought, more to himself than to Elsa. But you should. We'll end things here for tonight. She dispersed into scattering golden particles. Pulling himself from the projected state had gotten much easier over time and no longer threatened to make him nauseous. His eyes remained closed as he felt Yui drape his arm over her like she usually did. He pulled her closer gently, almost an automatic reaction now, as he thought about what to say to her. He'd momentarily forgotten that he was pitching a tent. Stiffening for only a moment, Yui mumbled to herself. What the hell are you dreaming about, damn thing is rock hard. And poking right into the gap between her upper thighs. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced it, but this one was definitely more pronounced. She had become aware that morning wood was most definitely not a myth. The jury was still out on blue balls. Issei could feel his entire body heat up, embarrassed by her description. Elsa often had that effect on him, even without him touching her. The worst time was when she started dancing naked. Sorry. He whispered, forgetting that he had still been pretending to sleep until he thought of the right words to say. If it weren't for the fact that she was being held in place, Yui would have jumped out of the bed when his voice startled her. You're awake, she asked in a quiet and high-pitched whisper. Not wanting to make the situation awkward with his current state, Issei went to move his arm away. Yui wasn't letting that happen and firmly held onto the limb. Her thumb stroked the hardened and warmer than normal skin, a habit she'd developed after she snuck in just after his reincarnation. Yay. Something seemed off when I noticed you coming in. I thought you might want to talk. A soft smile crossed her lips and she held the arm a little firmer for a moment. A gesture that said she appreciated him wanting to comfort her, not that Issei had done anything different whenever he thought she was upset. Is there something you want to talk about, I mean? Yui bit her lower lip lightly, the anxiety she felt over the subject coming back full force. Now she was almost regretting coming in his room. She wasn't ready to say it, not yet. Do I have to say I love you? Do I have to be okay as one of many? Do I have to be willing to sleep with you to prove it, to have my feelings reciprocated? Do I have sleep with them? Do I have to be held at a lower standing because I'm human? Do I have to? She wanted to barrage him with these questions, but she was just too scared to. The answers could be scarier than she was able to handle. You don't have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable. He answered. Even though he hadn't heard her thoughts, his response covered all of them. Issei wasn't good with reading between the lines with most of the girls he was around all the time. But it seemed as though he had a greater understanding when it came to Kaori and herself. Momo and Reya would have to set him straight soon, or their chances might just be ruined. If Sona was serious about that whole marriage thing, she had even more work ahead of her. Yui would have included Rias in that scenario too, but she had obviously made her interest known today, if his affectionate giddiness was anything to go by. She wanted to hear the details of what happened to have such an effect on him. Did I overstep with the kiss on the cheek? More like, didn't step far enough. Was what she wanted to say. Issei was watching and feeling for how she would respond. He was trying to get any nonverbal admissions that he was right. The girl in his arms, along with the one down the hall, were immensely important to him. They were people he could trust, people he could rely on, and they had given him his family back. Their beauty was just a bonus, both inside and out. Yes, they beat on him every so often, but it was acknowledged and agreed upon from the beginning. If he slipped, they'd give a physical corrective measure. Behind that though, were two young women who wanted to help someone that acknowledged there was a problem. Someone who wanted to better himself, just as they did every day with their kendo training. I don't want you to treat Kaori and I differently. She mumbled. It wasn't an answer to either of his questions, verbal or nonverbal. But in a way, it was an answer to both. With anyone else, he probably wouldn't have understood and asked her to clarify what she meant. But spending nearly every day with him let Issei understand. He hadn't overstepped, but she would have liked a kiss like the one he had shared with Kaori. She wasn't ready to say it, but she did love him. If he ended up being wrong about any of this, Yui was sure to reprimand him. What was it Matsuda said after watching that one American movie? Ah, that's right. Gotta risk it to get the biscuit. In other words, go for it. With his arm that wasn't around her, Issei propped himself up, the movement making her look over her shoulder. Her grip hadn't let his arm go, and Issei used that to turn Yui onto her back, leaving her halfway underneath him. She looked curious about his movements and also a bit nervous because of the position they were in. Her grip relaxed enough for him to remove his hand, bringing it up to her cheek. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly, asking a silent question. The hand she that had been holding his with came to rest on the back of the palm against her cheek as he smiled down at her. In that one instant, she saw that he understood. Issei understood that she just couldn't open herself up like that yet, that it would take time. That smile said to her that while he'd wait until she was ready to vocalize it, he'd still give her what she wanted in the meantime. To feel like she mattered to him just as much as any of the others, if not more so. I know you think it's wrong, but I care about the two of you very much, and I want you to be a part of my life for as long as you're willing. Once you are ready, I'll tell you just how much. Without giving her any chance to respond, Issei lowered himself towards her. For a brief second, Yui tried to back her head away from his before she caught herself. This is what she wanted, there was no reason to shy away now. She closed her eyes just before his lips made contact with hers. Once they had, Yui wondered what she was so afraid of. The only time she'd ever felt even slightly hurt by Issei was when he lied about the devils. He'd never aimed to hurt her. The kiss started off chaste, just a light touching of one pair of lips on another. The warmth and relief Yui felt gave her the courage to go for more. Her hands came up and grabbed the sides of his face, holding him in place, letting him know that she wanted more. The pressure between them increased a bit and Yui opened her lips, taking things a step further than Kaori had so far. Their tongues danced against each other's for what seemed like hours. Moving, twirling, tasting, it was a blur to them as they each got lost in this new aspect of their friendship relationship. Yui knew that she'd regress into her fears once the morning came, so she wanted to be at least one more step ahead of Kaori before then. She grasped the hand held to her cheek, dragging it against her yellow-buttoned pajama shirt. Yui brought it down to the hem and slid underneath. She wanted to squirm at the feeling of his hand lightly skimming her bare skin. Hip to stomach, stomach to torso, torso to chest, his touch felt like a small electric current before it came to rest where she was aiming. His fingers brushed against the underside of her breast, sweeping from her sternum towards her side. She gasped into the kiss, the feeling was different than she'd expected. It was like Issei was caressing her very heart as the nerves fired off. She felt his excitement renew as it brushed against the top of her left thigh. He cupped her breast, letting her feel the warmth of his larger hand before giving a light squeeze. Breathless and in need of air, the two pulled apart. Her pink eyes looked into his light brown, almost copper. Yui was surprised by how well she was taking their position. She didn't feel like she was subjugated, controlled by him, like she thought her first experience of this kind would be. She welcomed it. Like this, she could say anything, do anything. Tell me, Issei. I need to hear you say it. Even to her own ears, her voice had never sounded seductive like it did right now. His glazed eyes refocused onto her as he caught his breath. Another squeeze to her breast and he smiled, inching closer but no contact being made. I love you, Yui Katase. Even if you can't say it yet, I know you love me too. I want to make you happy, I want you to be happy. I want to. He couldn't say any more as she had leaned up to kiss him again. The only ones that mattered right now were the two of them. The devils be damned, the world be damned, right now he was hers. They kissed passionately, they explored each other's bodies as much as she was comfortable with through their hands. For tonight, they were just together. When she woke up in the morning, Yui didn't care about her topless state or the warm object she felt prodding her from the gap between her thighs yet again. In a state of fading bravery, she rolled her hips backwards. The warmth from the protrusion could be felt even through both articles of thin cloth that were their underwear. As her hips rolled forward to their original place, her breath hitched as a particular spot was caressed. She wanted to do it again, but her strength had drained away and it was time to get up. She hadn't returned the words, but in time she would. Until then, she was more than happy to just enjoy the affection given to her. Buttoning her pajama shirt, Issei started to wake and a realization came to her. Her groan brought him to open his eyes and look at her. Something wrong? Issei asked innocently. Button secured, Yui put her face in her hands. I'm in a harem. The words made it sound like her very life was ending. Sitting up, Issei tilted his head. Is two girls considered a harem? She watched as Issei tried to hide his morning wood, moving the blankets to his lap. With a shake of her head and a sigh, Yui turned to get ready for school. Sometimes, you're an idiot. She saw his lopsided grin as he stood up, apparently deeming his condition dealt with. I love you too, Yui. It was clear that Issei wanted to make her more comfortable with the words being tossed around, but just as she thought last night, the words felt like hardening cement in her mouth and she couldn't say them. Instead she turned around, flicking him in the center of the forehead before a quick and light kiss on the lips. In the student council office, Sona stared at her friend with wide, unbelieving eyes. Her glasses nearly falling from her face. How? Her voice was quiet, the disbelief clear in her tone. Surely there was another explanation here. Alcohol or drugs being the main ones coming to mind. But neither Rias nor Issei were that type of person, Sona knew that for a fact. Pure-blooded devils were also resistant to such human things, so it was impossible that she'd been drugged by someone else. It's the only explanation I can come up with, Sona. It was too specific to be anything else. Rias said, her bright red face turned to the side, unable to look at her friend. Issei had somehow channeled her oldest family trait, one that neither she or her sister were too attuned with. Her mother being from the now extinct Gop house, being the cause of that. It was there, just in a very diluted way, an occasional thought that was easily pushed aside. It was how Sona reasoned that her sister felt the need to wear such revealing costumes all the time. Clearing her throat, Sona pushed for more information. And then. She had felt a change in Issei yesterday afternoon. It wasn't that rare of an occurrence really, but it happened mostly at night when she figured he was asleep. The one she felt yesterday was easily more potent than any of the others. Sona thought that maybe Rias had accidentally shown more than she meant to. Rias pulled her crossed arms tighter against herself. The traits mixed. Having regained her composure, Sona placed her chin against steepled hands. Mixed? What does she? The light bulb went off, and suddenly she knew why Rias was so embarrassed. But the controlled tone, hiding the amusement she felt from Rias being on the other end for once, Sona asked Rias the most important question. Did you have sex with my pawn? Rias shook her head violently. No. The embarrassment doubled, and the Grimoire heiress mumbled something not even a devil's ears could pick up. Again. Those had apparently been the wrong words to use, as Rias looked like she was about to cry from how mortified she was. I didn't hear you, Rias, please repeat what you said. Sona said, using words that in no way could be misunderstood. I did, it's solo. Sona understood how admitting that to someone else could be embarrassing if they were human, or had been. But devils had no such barriers in regards to masturbating. Hell, her sister had given her a live step-by-step tutorial when she was 10. That was a memory she wanted to erase from her mind, to the point that she'd asked around for someone to alter her memories. No one would, they all just laughed at her. Something in the wording seemed off though. When you got home. Rias shook her head. The club room in the old school building. She shook her head again. Sona was running out of places she thought Rias would be comfortable doing such a thing. The Kendo's shrine. Rias snapped her head towards her, embarrassed tears flinging from her eyes as she shouted. In the store. I fingered myself on the floor of a manga shop's porn section. Knees bent, beep spread open, 3 knuckles deep. For beep's sake, Sona, I came so hard it soaked the chest portion of my dress when I squirted. I kept twitching from it, rubbing my beeps with each step. I was in such a haze afterwards, I didn't even realize what I'd done until this morning. Sona was of two minds at the moment. One side acknowledged that this was indeed a horribly embarrassing incident caused by something no devil knew could happen. But on the other side, it was quite possibly the funniest thing she'd ever heard. Finally, Rias had something even close to her most embarrassing moment. She would readily admit that Rias had gotten the award on this one. Mostly because she'd done it on the floor of a dirty store. There was one more thing she wanted to know. First off, beep is such a harsh term. Secondly, where was Ice? Putting her face in her hands, Rias sat back down in her chair, having stood up as she ranted. Surely Rias had done that once Issei had left the room, right? Right in front of me. It was the weakest she'd ever heard Rias speak. He saw you? Sona asked hesitantly. Issei. Saw. Everything. Crossing her arms, Sona gave Rias her hindsight advice. I think having sex with him would have been the better choice. Issei never held the same disdain for Monday that the rest of the school seemed to. Today especially, he was up and ready to go. Sure, school sucked, but the people around him made it enjoyable. His date with Rias yesterday and the events with Yui last night revitalized him. Sitting at the table, surprisingly, was all 5 residents of the Haidu household. His father was seated at the head, sipping on his coffee and reading the paper before heading to work. His mother had just taken the spot to his right after placing their breakfast on the table. She looked especially pleased, seeing a full table all ready to dig into her labors. She had been watching carefully, making sure that her husband didn't have any more outbursts, especially not with the girls at the table. He'd been better lately, but it was better safe than sorry. She didn't want to be caught off guard like that again. The hot frying pan in her hand had almost met the top of his head when Issei walked into the room. He wasn't even facing the same direction as their son, but somehow knew Issei was there. His face twisted into a scowl as Issei clipped on the bracelet she was sure he'd lost ages ago. Just as quick as that scowl formed, it was gone, and she let the pan back down to the stove. Hey Dad, how long is this project supposed to last anyway? Issei asked once he sat down at the opposite end, Yui and Kaori to each of his sides. Setting the mug down on the table, Koji lowered the paper to speak with his son. Not a clue, every time we think all the details are finalized, the buyer changes one detail or another. What they need 500 different material compositions is beyond me. He answered before going back to the paper. His father was an acquisition specialist. He handled larger orders brought in, seeking the materials or services for whatever their customer needed. This particular order had been in the works for a while now. It sounded like it originated from a cosplay company. They wanted mock armor pieces, staffs of different and specific designs, eyeglasses, shields, swords. Every item on the list had a very specific material composition to it. His father seemed to be having a hard time finding places to make all of it within a reasonable amount of time. "You're leaving already? Don't your classes start at 9? It's only 7:45. His mother asked as Issei stood up, grabbing his plate to be cleaned. The others were all still in the middle of their meal. The two girls didn't look like they were planning to head out anytime soon either. The walk to Kuo Academy only took 20 minutes, and that's if you had to stop at each and every intersection for traffic. Rinsing the plate off to clean easier, Issei turned towards his family. "Yay, I have to meet up with the VP. We're handing out evil forms to all the classes to get input on how the co-ed thing is working. They need to be filed and tallied before the summer break." Setting her utensils down, his mother tapped her chin, curious about something about his school that she hadn't heard about yet. "It sounds like the vice president does all the work. Where is the president in all of this?" Drying his hands off with the freshly washed hand towels, Issei walked to the fridge to grab a bottle of water to go. On some sort of study abroad program apparently. She's supposed to be coming back for the fall term. What was her name again? Issei twirled the bracelet around his wrist, something he did when lost in thought. Bela something ballet? No, Billow. Belize. He stood there, the women of the house watching him try to remember, when Mr. Haidu spoke without really thinking about what the outcome would be. Belat. Snapping his fingers, giving a thankful smile towards his father for helping him get the name right. It wouldn't do for him to not know who the leader of the student council technically was. "That's it. Wait, how do you know that? Is she well known or something?" Slamming down the last quarter cup of coffee he had, Koji Haidu scrambled to get himself out of there before too many questions could be asked. "Would you look at the time? Better head to work. Love you honey, see you later kids." Only grabbing his wallet and keys, he bolted out of the front door like a man possessed, forgetting his briefcase that held the details of what he needed to work on this morning. Kaori and Yui glanced from Issei to the direction his father had gone, just as confused as he was at what had just happened. His mother though, held a terrifyingly familiar look. Her face was absolutely blank, the happy air around her evaporating like water on hot coal. The girls didn't know what to make of it when they saw Issei suddenly shrinking back, away from the woman he loved above almost everything else. Issei managed to swallow his fear, enough to try and speak. That look she had, it brought phantom pains of a day a long time ago. One he'd never forget and never wanted to repeat. Mom." Her eyes never moved, nor did her body. "Girls, please go get ready for school." Yui and Kaori were worried from the tone of her voice and the way it made Issei start to shake lightly, his eyes fixed on her back. The woman that sat before them was not the same warm and caring one they'd come to know and love. Right now, she was frigid, like she wanted nothing more than to cut all ties with everyone around her. The only thing they had to do was to grab their bags from upstairs. But there was no way they were about to disobey Hinoka Haidu right now. Leaving Issei to whatever fate was to befall him, they got up and went to sit in the guest room they'd taken over. "Why are you afraid of this human, partner? Dragon tamer or not, your mother or not, she is nothing compared to you now." Drake had been woken up by the bombardment of fear coursing through his host. The Red Dragon was taking it easy the last few weeks, letting Elsha handle most aspects of his training. He would take over once things got serious, once there was an opponent that was worthy of his attention. Issei was also very attached to the previous host, for reasons Drake still didn't understand. The young man didn't answer, too shaken and not willing to take his undivided attention away from his mother. "Issei." He flinched as she spoke to him, more frightened right now than he had been in a long time. "Yes mother." Drake watched as his host slipped into a more distant and formal pattern than he'd seen since meeting Issei. It took more work on the dragon's part to be aware of the current surroundings, thanks to the bracelet. They had discovered that Fafner's bracelet was only supposed to dull the senses, not completely turn them down to human levels. Being that Issei had first placed it on his left wrist, which was his dominant hand, it completely sealed him off. The boosted gear may be attached to his soul, but the power still originated from his left hand. Issei was not yet powerful enough to overcome the seals placed on the jewelry. But at least with it on his right wrist, Drake and Elsha could communicate with him if they just concentrated a bit harder. The heightened emotions of his host were helping Drake get past the magic. "Sit." She pointed towards the chair his father had just vacated. Slowly, shakily, Issei complied. Once he did, his eyes stayed on the table. He heard his mother move and something coming to rest on the table, just out of view. "Look at me." She had her elbow on the table, her fingers curled in except for her pinky finger. Issei felt his stomach drop as his heart felt like it would burst. He didn't want to do this. He loved it when he was a little kid because it made him feel like an adult. But now he felt like he was staring down a firing squad. It felt like he was moving in slow motion as he put his own hand on the table, ever so slowly linking his pinky with hers. His hand was sweating as she tightened their locked fingers together. "Now, no lies, understood?" He nodded weakly. "Have you used the computer recently?" His tongue was lead in his mouth as his body started to feel a case of vertigo come over it. "Yes." Her eyes narrowed. "When?" "Tuesday and Wednesday, for my econ paper." His mother linked their fingers together a little harder. "Anything else?" Issei shook his head no. This felt just like before. It was like she hated him all over again. Issei cleared his throat. There was a pop-up though, a full-screen one. He could see her jaw clench, obviously understanding. Be descriptive, but not vulgar. Issei had to wonder if her dragon tamer trait was making him even more afraid of disappointing her now, because it certainly felt that way. It was one of those webcam sites. The girl was dancing before she started taking off clothes. It was a loop video and started over when she was naked and laid on the bed. He could see her nostrils flaring a bit, she was very upset right now. "Did you do anything that would bring that pop-up to our computer?" Issei immediately shook his head. "No, mother." It was like his finger was being pressed in a vice right now as his mother seemed to develop supernatural strength. "Do not lie to me. This would be the 4th time since you started high school, I'm sick of lies." She hissed. Hearing that from her was like a shot to the heart. Issei never wanted to lie to her if the situations weren't beyond normal human things. He really should have expected her to know he'd lied about the youth leader trip that was actually his training with Tannen. The others were small and inconsequential, but still he'd lied. He did know why his father was lashing out at him. And yes, it did hurt. His light body shaking returned and he couldn't maintain eye contact. "I'm not lying. I closed it without clicking on anything else. I swear, mother." He would pray, if it wouldn't cause him a migraine, that his mother wouldn't dig any deeper into anything else. "Fine." He slowly let out the breath that he'd been holding onto. "Where did you go for Golden Week?" When he flinched, her grip became tighter, her other fist clenched. Issei stayed silent. He couldn't lie to her, so his only option was to not answer. They hadn't done this in a long time, but when he was 5 they agreed to only tell the truth during the pinky promise conversations. It was how she found out about him looking at porn in the first place, when he was a kid. "Answer me." He wanted to. Issei wanted to tell her anything she wanted to know, but he was afraid of what would happen if she found out he'd become a creature that resided in the lake of fire, in hell. "Mother, please." But he couldn't, those were the rules as laid out by Sona. Humans couldn't be made aware of the supernatural unless they were affiliated in some way. "You're my son. I have every right to know what it is you're doing, even more so if it's leading you down the wrong path. How do I know that you're not out there committing crimes when you say you're doing school functions? How do I know that the cops won't be here to arrest you for sexual harassment or rape?" She exploded, both of their pinky fingers nearly turning blue from the force of her grip. Old habits die hard. Her husband had apparently been browsing the internet for naked young women again. Was she not good enough for him? Not attractive enough? Too old? Not willing to do whatever strange thing he was into? The anger brought about by his actions had quickly been shifted onto figuring out why her son had been lying to her about a few things. "The underworld," Issei said quietly. Inoka Haidu stopped, looking at her son like he was crazy. "Excuse me?" Issei gathered the courage to look his mother in the eyes and tell her the truth. "I went to the underworld, hell, during Golden Week. I was training to get stronger, to fight a devil." It was the truth, but he knew that without further context, it just sounded crazy. "Get out." She threw his hand away from her, standing up violently, sending the chair down to the ground. Issei stared at her, wide-eyed. Her anger mixed with the frustration. Her eyes were becoming bloodshot as tears built up. "Why?" Her voice shook as she tried to hold it together just a bit longer. "Why are you lying to me? What are you hiding?" He heard the stairs creak, one or both of the girls must have been standing there. His mother didn't notice it and kept escalating into a frantic state. "Is it drugs? Are you in a gang? Do the girls know? Is that why they all want to be with you?" She covered her mouth with her hands, her voice was muffled by the shaky appendages. "Is this payback for how awful I was to you? Because I beat you?" Issei heard 2 gasps from the stairs. Then saw a flash of blue come from the living room. Issei might not hate every Monday. But he sure hated this one. Fear. Sona felt it flood her entire being like nothing ever had. She had been stacking the evaluation forms with her queen, knight and rook when she nearly collapsed onto the floor. All three girls were by her side in an instant, helping her up. She couldn't focus on anything they might have been saying, instead trying to pinpoint what it was that had driven her pawn to such extremes so quickly. They even override the bracelet with such potency, she thought. When he had it on his right wrist, she knew that she'd only feel the bare minimum of their connection. Enough to know if he was safe or in danger, but that was it. The fear pulsing through him right now made it seem like he was being held against the point of a Serap's light spear. Standing on unsteady legs, Sona moved away from her peerage, ignoring them as they called out to her, and formed a circle a few feet from where she stood. She needed to get to him. The transportation circle didn't act the way Issei tried to rationalize it. It wasn't like the technique his favorite anime character could do. Instant transmission, or something like that. Sona had eventually gotten him to understand it by using one of the 2 video games she'd ever played for comparison. The short Italian plumber enters the tube through point A. Everything between him and point B is squished together like a vacuum-sealed bag to shorten the distance. Then he appears at the desired exit point. It wasn't the best explanation, but at the time, Sona didn't want to go into the details of dimensional travel. I wonder if sound echoes through it then. It was his attempt at making a stupid joke, but the fact of the matter is that sound does travel through. Sona stopped just before entering the circle to hear what was happening on the other side. During Golden Week, I was training to get stronger, to fight a devil. Her pawn's voice sounded like an echo in a metal chamber. But the unease in his tone was clear as day. The 4 devils in the room waited to hear what was next, as Sona had a suspicion of who he was talking to. She was hoping to be wrong. Why is Haidu revealing the supernatural? Tsubaki asked, her tone as even as it ever was. She had yet to call him by anything other than his last name. It wasn't because she didn't like him, Tsubaki told Sona in private that she was actually looking forward to getting to know him better as well. She just needed to get over her anxiety of dropping her guard around men. Tsubaki, Yura and Tomo looked to their king, waiting for an answer. Yay, he knows we have to keep it secret. Tomo added, rolling from her heels to her toes. The one in the room to spend the most time with him, however, stayed quiet. Yura didn't have the same connection with Issei that Momo and Reya did. She knew enough about him though to realize something wasn't right just by his tone. Get out. The breath was knocked from Sona's lungs as fear turned to pain. It wasn't physical pain, but she would have rather felt that compared to this emotional torture. Her pawn was experiencing an emotional rollercoaster. With her upbringing, Sona doubted she was even capable of feeling this way about her family. Their magic circle started to fade as her concentration was slipping away. Being the dutiful queen she was, Tsubaki took over and the circle flared back to life. How bad is it, Kaichu? Sona had fallen to one knee, slowly bringing herself back up with a hand on her desk. Crippling, it was the only way to describe it. Sona was finding it hard to think, let alone do anything else. She needed to buck up and get to him. The bracelet was keeping at least half of the turmoil away from her, so she couldn't imagine that Issei was able to do anything but stare into the distance right now, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Why? Why are you lying to me? What are you hiding? Call Momo and Reya, get them here as soon as possible. I'm going alone. Sona declared firmly. Because things were already bad enough, adding new faces into the mix wouldn't make it easier. This was a mental battle, not physical, not magical. Is it drugs? Are you in a gang? Do the girls know? Is that why they all want to be with you? Tsubaki rose a brow at that part, wondering who his mother was talking about in her hysterical rant. Sona stepped into the circle, making it flash as she was transported to the home of her pawn. As the circle died, they heard his mother one more time. Is this payback for how awful I was to you? Because I beat you? But the king now gone, the queen took command, taking out her phone to call the 2 Sona had requested. Yura stared at where the circle was just a moment ago, concerned for her newest friend. She didn't know how bad things were on the other side. What she did know was that sometimes, a heated moment would leave you with nothing but a lifetime of regret. She hoped Issei wouldn't have to learn that like she did. Hopefully Sona could prevent that from happening. Bring Momo and report back to the council office immediately. Tsubaki spoke into her phone, to Reya. The specifics aren't known yet. Haidu caused some sort of reaction with Kaichu, she's gone there to. Tsubaki was cut off, the other 2 girls turning to look at the queen. I see. The voice from the small speaker was muffled and incoherent for anyone else. No, I'm sure she has a plan. Just trust her. It was what they all needed to do. Sona Citri was nothing if not dedicated to the task she set for herself, they all knew that. Drag her to an alley and teleport out if you need to. Our king wanted you 2 here. I'm assuming she intends to bring Issei back with her, you can see him then. It was moments like this where someone wondered what kind of control one had over their life. Issei sat there in the kitchen with his mother, realizing how powerless he'd been to avoid this scenario. He felt frozen into the chair, paralyzed almost. It hadn't been him, but his father to bring his mother's wrath down upon him, however inadvertently. His lies hadn't been a product of his own accord, but the tale Sona had weaved for him to tell, at least the one his mom was asking about anyway. And so, because of one choice he made at the beginning of the school term, Issei sat and watched as his mother worked herself up more and more. The tears and heaving breaths of her being upset were offset by the rage displayed in her blazing eyes and clenched jaw. Where did he go from here? Telling the truth had done nothing but spin the situation further into its downward spiral. Lying would get him nowhere, he knew that. And now that Sona had appeared, as he could tell by the blue light in the living room and the slight flash of black hair he saw at the doorway, how would things change? Could his king help, or would her presence only make things worse? Well. His mother's voice was shaky, sorrow and rage at war with each other. There was slight pull at the air, so small that Issei didn't think his mother noticed it. It was then that Sona decided to make her presence known, rapping her knuckles against the frame of the entryway to the kitchen. The two Haidus turned to see her shift into full view at the doorway, her passive persona used in school present on her face. While Issei was slightly glad that she'd come to his aid, he didn't know how she'd become aware of the situation. He wondered if her cold facade would make things worse. His mother, however, began scrutinizing Sona intently, like a new piece of the puzzle had just revealed itself. Light brown, near copper eyes looked over every detail in seconds. "Pardon me, Mrs. Haidu, but I believe I may be of assistance." Sona spoke clearly, keeping her eyes on the adult in the room. Crossing her arms, his mother had a tinge of that anger directed to the new arrival. "And what brings you here? I don't believe I heard a knock on the door." She was assuming that Sona had just opened the door and walked inside like she owned the place. It didn't paint her in a positive light. The door was open. "I came to retrieve Issei for our work this morning and felt it beneficial for me to intervene in your conversation." Sona answered immediately. So that was the pull in the air Issei felt. She must have magically opened the door because the thing creaked pretty loudly under normal circumstances. Beneficial how? Sona adjusted her glasses, taking a carefully hidden breath to calm herself. Issei noticed that she almost looked nervous. He didn't understand why that would be. Sona was a high-class devil and dealt with people far more fearsome than his mother. Well, in terms of physical attributes anyway, his mother could be quite intimidating when she wanted to be. Her emotions are affecting her. It's likely how she knew something was going on. Drake answered, surprising Issei. They had a harder time talking with the bracelet on, even if it were on his right wrist. It was possible, it just took a little more from each of them. But right now, Drake was coming through as clear as he would without it. Issei remembered then, being told that a sacred gear responds to emotion, and his were pretty potent at the moment. "I heard you state that you were concerned over your son's activities as of late, that he might be involved in something illegal or immoral. I can assure you that he is not." Both mother and son gave the pure-blood devil a curious look. Issei, because he was curious about just what it was that she'd revealed to placate his mother. Mrs. Haidu, because some of the thoughts churning in her mind became her primary designation for this girl in front of her. That being, Sona Shitori was involved with whatever her son had been up to, possibly even being the one in charge. It fit in her mind perfectly, fitting the image she had of similar young women from her past. The cold and calculating types were always the ringleaders, stringing along someone else by offering them some long-desired dream. For her son, that would have unfortunately involved being around a mass of women. Preferably with the sex drive of a rabbit and the standards of any bottom-feeding organism. No. He's been getting better, I know that. Mrs. Haidu berated herself. It was her old habits creeping up again. And the two girls upstairs were around before all this mess started. She had no reason to think Issei was around these girls for that reason. Issei has been working for me, beginning shortly after he started at Kuo Academy. I apologize in advance, for I am unable to share much of the details with you as of yet. Everyone involved is under a strict non-disclosure agreement. If you require any further proof of my claims, Kaori Murayama can provide it. This work is under the same umbrella corporation that her parents work for and is owned by my family. With widened eyes, the only adult in the room glanced between Sona and Issei. Her son looked as though he were ashamed, like he was a part of the life she had accused him of. But if what Sona said was true, then that just didn't seem possible. The company that Kaori's parents worked for had the cleanest record of pretty much any major organization in the medical field. They were clear and concise in what practices they were a part of. Each and every product worked for its designated use, as described. This led to thoughts on her voiced concerns. If he's working for the same group, why did he come home all scraped up during Golden Week? The Bridgewater Corporation is mainly medical groups and research-based companies. She knew that because the company had been in several news segments going on about global expansion over the last decade and how they were among the most successful after such an explosive growth period. Adjusting her glasses, Sona glanced at her pawn, who was looking at her like a savior delivered before the final blow claimed his life. Given the particulars of the relationship of this mother and son, that may have been close to the truth. Again Mrs. Haidu, due to the nature of the standard agreement used in each beginning venture, there isn't much I can tell you. Her violet eyes locked onto his mother, looking as professional as any business person found in the higher tiers of corporate society. Mrs. Haidu realized one thing then. She was right to think that Sona was the leader, but she had made a miscalculation. This young woman did not act this way due to her own actions and lessons. It was something bred into her by her family. The elite made sure they stayed elite. A child of such a family would be taught to act in a way to keep their secrets in the dark, read people they might do business with. That cold and calculating persona was through no fault of her own, but her parents'. The gaze behind rimmed glasses softened slightly, struggling to not shift towards Issei. Mrs. Haidu had another thought, this one regarding the conversation with Yui the other day. The sixth girl was now identified. But I know how much your son cares for you and strives to hold to the standard of honesty you instilled in him. There isn't much I can tell you, but here is what I can. Mrs. Haidu was sure of it now. Sona may not be as far along as the two girls living in her home or those two student council girls, but the young woman in front of her was at the very least interested. She would find out the how and why of these developing relationships her son had. Your son is helping me to establish an educational facility that will be the first of its kind. The richest of the rich or the poorest of the poor, everyone will have the chance to attend. There will be physical, academic, and spiritual education on par with the most prestigious facilities. The female devil turned stone cold serious as she finished. This is why you haven't been made aware of what your son is doing. The implications of what we will be doing will affect a great deal of individuals. If word spread to the wrong people, it would undermine everything I've done to achieve this goal. Allow me to also address any issues of compensation as well. As a working minor and a high school student, this is a concern our company has been adamant we stay within local and federal law. The main payment agreed upon was a performance-based stipend to be paid nearing the end of his contract. However, Issei has been performing above our initial hopes and has recently been approved a bonus of sorts. Mrs. Haidu could recall a few brief conversations with Ice about what he might want to do once he was done with school, and teaching was on that list. To hear that he was already actively participating in that very goal made her heart swell with pride. She just wished that there wasn't this secrecy around it. And what form does this bonus take? She asked, still minimally suspicious that there might be some less than appropriate payments given to her son. She was proud of the progress he had made in bettering himself, but as she could attest to, old habits die hard. Those urges would likely always be there for him. Her son had perked up as well, wanting to hear how he was being rewarded. Issei was also wondering how he had gone above and beyond her expectations of him. The Bridgewater Corporation will pay for his education at Kuo Academy in full. The payment you made will be refunded to you within the week. This is due to the limits placed on minors in terms of compensation and the taxes they would have to pay. All work-related expenses will be paid by me upfront, he will not have to worry about any sort of reimbursement process. That was a great help actually. The promotion Koji received certainly made paying for the school easier, but there was still a strain placed on them due to the renovations on their home that were still being paid for. Speaking of Koji, she had just the person to ask about a certain topic right in front of her. Ilabielet, what kind of person is she? The turn in the conversation had Sona raising an eyebrow. Why do you ask? There were a few less than innocent ways Hinoka Haidu could answer that. Her suspicions had yet to be absolutely confirmed yet, but the dots were nearly connected already, thanks to the back-forth of Issei and Koji. I have a good suspicion that your student body president has been participating in activities not in line with your school's guidelines. And if it turned out to be true, she prayed to any and all deities that Issei stayed far away from her. Surely Yui and Kaori would help with that. Once the four of them were outside, Issei, Yui and Kaori saw Sona take a deep breath, her shoulders easing as she released it. Issei felt similar, they had defused a bad situation that was primed and ready to get worse. It was still a little early for the kendo girls to be heading out, but they thought it best to leave with Issei after the events that had just passed. Each of the three girls knew that he might need a shoulder to lean on right now, with how attached to his mother Issei was. Aichu, was that true, what you said in there? Issei asked, as he felt the tension of the morning easing from himself also. He wasn't sure if his mother was serious about him leaving, but he really didn't want to find out. It was a subject I had yet to talk to you about. As a member of my peerage eyes, your tuition is paid for by me. If you wanted to get a doctorate in physics, I would pay for it all. She knew that Issei was not likely to pursue anything past a bachelor's degree, but the offer would always be there. Devils had long lifespans, so there was always the chance that he could go back to school in a few centuries, and she wanted to make it known that she supported that decision. Thank you. My dad makes decent money, but I know paying for Kuo was putting some strain on them. Issei got quiet for a few more seconds, but had his eyes locked onto Sona as they walked. Yui and Kaori saw an amount of admiration coming from him that they wished had been on them instead. And for helping me out back there, I really can't thank you enough. Sona gave him a small smile, saying that it was no problem. The walk to Kuo was a silent one, but the Citri heiress's mind was turning to berating herself. Strategy was her strong suit, thinking ahead to keep things from going out of her control. Yet having Issei in her peerage was proving how much she truly had left to improve. When her suspicions had been confirmed about his mother, she should have worked on plans for things like the altercation this morning. But she hadn't. What were the odds of a member of her peerage being partially turned dragon, and then his mother having dragon tamer traits? They were laughable at best. So abysmally small that Sona had written it off as impossible. And when it turned out that was exactly the case, she had done nothing with that information. Issei had already been pretty attached to his mother, from what she'd gathered. His new situation had only exacerbated it. The tales of a dragon being pushed away by the tamer they bond with never had happy endings. Death and destruction was the usual result. Sona had almost let her own actions tear her plans apart. What I wouldn't give to had Ria's mental manipulation aptitude. She thought, waiting for the crosswalk to give them the sign to cross. Instead of building up that ability, Sona had spent time learning negotiation tactics. She wanted to follow her family's footsteps, using words and reputation to get what she wanted. Magical coercion was not what she wanted to use in order to achieve her goals. But there was no denying that the skill would have been helpful this morning. Calling Rias probably would have taken too long as well, with what her friend had revealed this morning. That was yet another thing put on her plate. Now she would need to get Issei in front of Lord Beelzebub to see if his pieces were acting up. No peerage member had ever been recorded as able to draw upon the master's family trait like Issei had yesterday. It was time she switched tactics, like she'd been planning to do. Her pawn's training had been primarily power-focused for the next few weeks until she would hopefully set him to train with Tiamat. She would guide him in strategy. This would also have the added bonus of prepping him for one of her initial steps that she told Rias of. She was going to teach Issei chess strategies. Now that things were at least somewhat dealt with at the Haidu home, Sona was going to turn her attention to something Mrs. Haidu brought up. Was the president of her school's student council posting adult-oriented videos of herself while wearing the uniform? There was little she could do about that damned woman doing it in general, but using the Kuo uniform was absolutely not going to fly. That damn succubus is too good at giving me migraines. To say the atmosphere in the clubroom was strange would be underselling it by a large amount. It was clear to everyone that something had happened yesterday between Rias and the only pawn in the Citri group. When Akeno had tried to tease it out of her king, Rias had blushed so hard that she couldn't speak before running away. That was odd, Rias was not the type to shy away. She had walked around the clubroom completely naked, with her, Kaneko and Kiba present, and hadn't even bat an eye. Whatever happened, it must have been very intimate. If she didn't know Rias better, she'd say that her friend had thrown caution to the wind and had sex with him. She had tried catching the young man in the first-year hallway on several of the breaks between classes, but hadn't seen him at all. She had seen those two kendo girls, but they didn't seem to like her for some reason. Their faces had gone from glaring to sadly introspective. Something had most definitely happened over the last 24 hours, and not all of it good, she gathered. Placing the tea tray on the table, Akeno tried her luck in a different way, playing the worried senior card. Has anyone seen Issei today? Her question was mainly directed towards Kiba, since they were in the same year, but if she could get something out of Rias, she'd be happy and work with it. Kiba shook his head. I haven't. Normally I see him on the way back from lunch, but he wasn't there at the time. Rias blushed a little bit, but not nearly as much as she had this morning. She fidgeted in her chair behind the desk. That's a shame, I was hoping we could get to know him a bit. I looked for him today, and didn't see him either. Rias blushed harder. What happened between you two yesterday? Akeno wondered. It was starting to really get under her skin that her friend was being so tight-lipped about the whole date. She hadn't shared a single blip about the entire day. We're better off without him. Kaneko spoke, picking up a Rice Krispie treat from her mound of candy. Akeno had to fight her eyes from widening as Rias actually glared at the small rook. Whatever it was, you liked it. She thought with a snicker. Rias was very protective over those she cared for. Issei had done something right yesterday, that much was clear to her now. I don't know about that, Kaneko. Sona says that he's about as strong as I am now. At this rate, he'll be our ace in the hole for getting Rias free. Hineko swallowed her sugary treat before retorting. Yeah, just to have another guy who only wants to get her naked. Rias turned her chair to face away from them, but not before Akeno caught the absolutely atomic red blush all over her face. Oh yes, Issei saw more than just a bit of cleavage yesterday. Akeno was going to have a very good time finding out what happened and then teasing Rias with it for months. I wonder what that would be like, dating a younger guy. I've heard some whispers about how he treats the girls close to him, and I have to admit that I'm a bit curious. Akeno. Rias cut her off. Her tone was obviously meant to be stern, but there was a waver in it that all could hear. The orc members could all see the blush that had crept up the neck of their king. My date with Ice was fine. We walked around and shopped a bit, had lunch, and then went to a manga shop where I found a gift for my nephew. My goal was to get to know him better, and that's what happened. Akeno peered at her king intently, looking for some subtle sign, something to say what else had happened. Rias was silently telling her to back off, to stop prying. Akeno gave a small bow of her head, but the teasing smile never left. Rias wouldn't be able to hold out forever, whatever happened was going to come out eventually. Would you go out with him again? Kiba spoke up as he picked up the book he'd been reading for the last few days. Akeno waited as Rias seemed to carefully consider her response, even Kaneko seemed interested in what their master would say. At some point, yes. We both have busy schedules, so a second date will probably have to wait a while. That was when Akeno figured something had to have embarrassed Rias. Other than school work or stray hunts, the orc really didn't do much. She could see Issei claiming a busy schedule with his training, student council work, and the kendo club. But besides a few meetings here and there, Rias usually did as she pleased when she had free time. Other than the overly affectionate way her brother doted on her, Rias was not embarrassed by much. It made her all the more eager to speak with him. The perception of passing time is a strange thing. For Issei, it had become more noticeable over the last 10 days. From the time he woke up until leaving for school, seconds seemed everlasting. While he was on school grounds, it seemed to be the reverse, and the sun would be setting in the blink of an eye. The source of which was obviously the confrontation he had caused. Greg had berated him for the submission he'd shown to his mother. A dragon does not bow. Issei wondered if that was a big part of the mentality that got him and Albion sealed in the first place. If the two dragons had been more conscious of what had been going on around them, they might still have their own bodies. Queen's Gambit. Issei guessed. Sona had given him a day free of any responsibilities and then changed tactics. She was teaching him chess strategies to help him see beyond the current move an opponent was making. Since the day Sona teleported in, she'd been much more attentive to him. Every morning so far, his king had asked about the mood at home. Every day she asked, he gave the same answer. Tense and quiet. His mother seemed torn on how to feel. She wasn't cold to him, like she had been before his reform, but she didn't initiate any conversation. It was apparent that she was still upset over him lying to her, but now she had an adequate enough reason for the deception. Sona had provided some documentation about his employment, with a promise for full disclosure once phase 1 was completed. Close, but no. Teresh. Sona reset the board and tried another, testing how much her pawn was retaining. He understood the game well enough. How the pieces moved had only taken a few minutes. But anything more than just reacting was coming slowly. The relationships with his friends had taken a small turn as well. Yui and Kaori had started alternating which of them climbed into his bed now. Momo and Reya had deemed that he needed to be pressured a little bit more. Each and every kiss had a tongue slipped in now. Reya would occasionally slide a hand over his crotch for an extra measure of torture. Oddly enough, Yui and Kaori didn't react the way they used to, they simply eyed him for a moment and then continued with the day. How about this one? Sona had placed a knight, pawn and rook out onto the field for the white side, with a pawn and knight beside each other for the black. Issei found himself glancing up from the board more than he meant to. He couldn't help it, Sona's violet eyes just had a way of drawing him in. No matter how many times he told himself to keep the thoughts away, if they were in close proximity for long enough, he'd remember that dream from when they first met. Kaori attack. He answered without looking back to the board. He loved Yui and Kaori, had admitted it to himself and to one of them, but when Sona smiled at him, it was like the problems of the world vanished. He had to shake his head to remember where he was and what he was doing. Kings don't get into relationships with servants. Just like oil and water, they can be close, but they never mix. It was safer not to go down that road. Very good Issei. Even though it felt like his brain was going to melt, Issei felt that he had to keep putting everything into his training. Sona told him that they'd have to eventually fill in his parents about his reincarnation. When that day came, Issei wanted to be able to show his parents that he would make something of himself. When she reset the board, Sona stood from the couch on the opposite side of the table in her office. She was not as developed as Momo, Reya or Murayama, but watching her take that deep breath and the movements because of it were still captivating. I'm never going to kick this breast fetish, am I? He asked, more to himself than to either voices residing in his head. I don't see the problem with appreciating them, so long as you can keep yourself under control. While Elsha didn't seem to find issue with his lingering eyes, drag was another matter. You should keep your mind on the training and not on watching a woman's chest. Once you've won your battle, then you'll have earned a reward. Issei couldn't argue with either one's logic. As long as he kept his head in the game, a little peek here and there wouldn't hurt anything. It wasn't like he was being left completely deprived either. Yui had a habit of holding his hand to her chest while she slept now, her nightgown was often found mostly unbuttoned by morning, giving him full view of those perky mounds. It's time that you and I talked about a few things, Issei. Sona said, bringing him back to the situation at hand. She had moved to sit at her desk, her serious persona fully in place. With a gesture of her hand, she told Issei to sit across from her. Sona steepled her hands on the desk, a move Issei had come to associate with matters that were important and required her full attention. While I usually agree with keeping family issues within said family, you are a part of my family now. I'm sorry for the disturbance that occurred because of our current president. But I have to ask you to clarify some of the things I and the other heard your mother say. Issei wilted, knowing where this was most likely going. It wasn't a pleasant memory, and not just because of the physical pain from that day. It hurt to think of it because in that moment he hadn't felt like his mother had cared about his well-being at all. Even now, that day gave him the impression that he was expendable in her eyes. It was stupid and he knew that it wasn't true. But it didn't matter how much he corrected his thoughts after the fact, that initial feeling had always remained. It was years ago when I was 11 and that was the only time. He started before she had even truly asked. Sona sat back in her chair, ready to listen to the events. My mom had already been angry because she found magazines in my room. She went to go look online for a recipe and the computer was filled with pictures. She just figured that I was the one who did it. Sona bounced one leg over the other, trying to ease the uncomfortable feeling radiating to her. Issei really didn't want to talk about this. So she hit you? It wasn't a question, as she'd heard his mother admit it. Issei nodded. Was it one strike? He shook his head. How many times? That uncomfortable feeling grew as Issei hesitated to answer for a moment. I don't know. Issei snapped his mouth shut before he said anything more. He didn't want to build any animosity between the people in his life. And saying that he was pretty sure the pain had knocked him out would not make anything better. Was it with her hand? Issei was really starting to wish she would drop the topic. But he still shook his head no. If she asked, he would tell her, but he wasn't about to offer up everything. The belt, what part of the belt needn't be mentioned? Any injuries? No, just a few red marks. And wasn't that surprising? By all logic, he should have been cut and bruised with a broken rib or two from that. Issei counted himself lucky that he was of a sturdier build. Sona could feel the apprehension on this topic and it was making her stomach twist. He was hiding something, but she couldn't tell what. His mother was going to be an important figure in his life, so she would just have to keep an eye out for any outbursts like that, not for his physical safety, but his mental stability. Okay, next topic. She could see and feel Issei relax, and it was like she could breathe comfortably again. How do you feel about Rias? The complete change in the mood of this conversation left him mentally unbalanced for a second. He wasn't sure what kind of response she was looking for here. Was she asking what he personally felt about her as a person or as a devil? Let me try a different approach. Rias told me what happened in that manga shop. Sona raised a hand to stop whatever Issei was going to say in his defense. She understood that his background would have it seeming like he'd somehow coerced her to do it. What happened was no fault of yours, not directly. You channeled something that by all knowledge shouldn't have been possible. It is very likely to complete. Sona stopped when a blue circle appeared next to her ear. Issei watched and waited as his king listened to the voice on the other end. She had seemed a bit frustrated by the interruption, at least at first. When her expression became more serious than he was used to, he wondered what was being said. It will be done and reported upon completion. Sona closed the circle with a flash of irritation on her face. Without preamble, Sona switched gears to the more important issue at hand. Go home, eat well and get some rest. I had hoped to better prepare you, but tonight will be your first stray hunt. Tsubaki will come to you once we're all ready, expect her around midnight. End of the here. So that's it for today's video guys. Before you go, just like the video and share it with your friends. Bye.